Welcome to those that are just joining us. As people are trickling in, I'll just say a few words. So first of all, just a reminder that the session today is being recorded. Welcome to the webinar. Today we're looking at the changing shape of energy demand in industry. This has been organised by the Energy Demand Research Centre. We are, in terms of the length of the session, expecting to finish at 3, so an hour. We have 4 speakers. I will be introducing each speaker and then there'll be time for questions at the end. I'll also be introducing Mari, Director of EDRC, to say a few words once we get going. Just in terms of questions, just to say, please put them in the chat if possible. And if there's a particular person you want to aim the question to, then please make that clear. But otherwise, please don't use the chat if possible. It just helps us identify what are questions compared to what might be background chat. So can we have the next slide, please, Nargis? And I will hand over to Professor Mari Martiskainen, Director of EDRC, to introduce the centre.
Hello all. Hi, good afternoon. Sorry for the slight delay. My camera and my microphone were not actually on, but now they are. So thanks for allowing me to speak and to be on the screen. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for all the organisers. So I just wanted to really quickly highlight that EDRC is a big energy demand research centre. So we have funding from UKRI over 5 years, and myself, I am a director of EDRC, and Sarah is co-director. And we have grown considerably since we started in 2023. So we now have close to 100 researchers across almost 16 different universities. And our main funding comes from EPSRC and ESRC. And we also have a flexible fund, which at the moment is on pause while we are going through our sort of centre priority review following our midterm review earlier sort of this year, last year as well. And we have 5 main research themes. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining what those are, but I would really encourage you to go and have a look at our website and learn more about how energy demand is relevant in terms of place-based action, what it means for flexibility and flexibility of demand in particular, and what do we need to do in terms of when we think about governance and how we govern energy demand decisions, and also thinking about what our future energy demand might look like. And last but not least, what is a sort of equitable and fair energy demand action, particularly thinking about if we are reducing demand. But I think today's event is really important, particularly thinking about we have seen quite a lot of warm weather over the last few days. I'm in my Birmingham office today, and it's very, very warm here today. So just thinking in the news just a few weeks ago, I saw that, for example, data centers are now emitting a lot of excess heat. So energy demand in industry and that the implications that it has is really, really key. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from our speakers today. And I'll hand over back to Sarah for introducing those. But thank you so much for everybody to join today. And please have a look at our website as well for the wide range of research that we do. Thank you.
Thanks, Mari. Nargis, can we have the next slide? So just to set the scene, then we realise that industrial energy demand is changing quite rapidly. Here we've got a range of perspectives that enable us to explore and discuss this. And in terms of that perspective, we're thinking about implications for energy demand, for the system itself, for industrial competitiveness, but also thinking then about what are the practical pathways to overcome some of the issues and enable industry to transition in a way that is resilient and low carbon for the economy. So we'll stop the screen share and allow John to screen share. And whilst John's doing that, I'll just introduce. So John is Chief Technology Officer at Energy Systems Catapult, working to identify key innovation challenges and to drive a range of major new research, knowledge, and product development initiatives. Over to you, John.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can I just check that you can hear me?
Yes, and we can
Brilliant.
see the slides. Thank you.
Excellent. Right. So yeah, I'm really delighted to be here today. And I guess I'm doing the sort of the top level scene setting of where industrial energy demand is sort of shifting. And so I thought I'd do that with three sort of slides setting out what I think are some important points. But I'm sorry, I'm trying to get the slides to move on. There we go. Before that, a quick sort of introduction to the Energy Systems Catapult for those who haven't come across us before. We're one of 9 catapults in the UK set up to accelerate growth in what are considered to be important or strategically important areas of the UK economy. They sort of do what they say on the tin. So High Value Manufacturing Catapult is focused on high value manufacturing. Energy Systems Catapult is focused on accelerating clean energy innovation and helping to sort of transform the energy system from what it is today to what it needs to be for the future. We help energy innovators scale up and grow their technologies. We're an independent, not-for-profit research and technology organisation based again in Birmingham, about 250 staff, and we're established and supported by Innovate UK. So that's the catapult. On to the substance of the presentation. So my first slide is really about the way energy in industry, energy use is changing, and make the point that it's actually been changing considerably over the past 50 years. It's not a new phenomenon at all. And I've plotted here sort of consumption of energy by industry against sort of an index of production of how much the UK has been producing. And you can see that over the past 50 years, production has more or less doubled, while energy consumption fell by 2/3. So these are long-term trends. Now, I will accept that the production or the things that are included within production are not quite the same as what we're including within energy consumption, but the trend is fairly clear. And there are a lot of drivers to this. Firstly, offshoring, but also sort of the changing nature of demand. People are buying sort of less steel and more sort of disposable products, etc. We're seeing energy intensity sort of change quite considerably, and the relative cost of energy has a huge impact on this. That we've seen a sort of a shift away from using coal to gas as gas became cheaper, and as I'm going to sort of demonstrate, I think we're going to see much more of a shift to electrification in the future. And the other point that's sort of worth noting is that over this this last 50 years, year on year, we've seen something like a 2% increase or improvement in energy efficiency each year, which is a big step forwards. But I've flagged that what we really must note is it's not just about sort of energy, it's how we actually use energy. And different types of energy are used more or less effectively. And so the fact that we are replacing, use of gas with use of electricity doesn't mean we need to replace that one for one. And technologies such as heat pumps can enable us to deliver an awful lot more with electrical heating rather than burning fossil fuels. Moving on, that was the first slide. Next slide is relative cost of energy. And what we're seeing here, again, this is actually only over 15 years, is the relative cost of solar or electricity generated by solar has come down dramatically, noting this is a logarithmic scale. It's already cheaper than the cost of oil. It's likely to be cheaper than the cost of gas within another 10 years. And in many parts of the world, it's already the cheapest way to generate electricity today. And as it sort of moves on, this is going to become more and more the dominant sort of source of energy, because it's more electricity is going to become the dominant source of energy because it's so much cheaper. Now, there are no sort of allowances for carbon costs and things within this. This is very much, the actual costs of energy, and it is important to note that the cost of solar is very dependent on the latitude at which it's being generated. And countries like the UK that are at a fairly sort of high latitude and therefore have much less solar resource available are going to have big problems with the price of energy moving forwards. So that's slide number 2. And the third one then is what we're seeing change within the energy system as a whole. So if we look back 10 years, we had 60 large power stations, sorry, 10 years, look back to 1990, had about 60 large power stations which were being controlled to deliver the amount of supply of electricity we needed to meet the demand for electricity. If we look forward to 2050, we're expecting to have 60 million smart energy devices, including in industry, that are going to be varying their demand to match the available supply. So that's a complete sort of turnaround in the way that the system is going to operate, largely because we're moving from a world where electricity is dominated by the cost of gas and the fuel used to generate it, to one where it's dominated by the cost of capital, and therefore we need to maximize the generation that we have available. So for industry, this means that and for sort of homes and businesses, that the ability to flex demand between times when electricity is expensive and times when electricity is cheap is going to become increasingly important. And so that's sort of the third message really, is that yes, we're looking at an electric future, but that's going to have profound effects on the way we operate our systems, very much with an emphasis on flexibility. So sort of in summary, points I'm sort of going to make is energy is where energy is a dominant cost of production. We're going to see manufacturing tend to locate to areas with lower energy costs. And that's why, it's so important that the UK, which has particularly high energy costs at the moment, takes action to address that. Electricity generated from solar and firmed by batteries is already the cheapest form of energy in many parts of the world. That's only going to increase. And really for most lower temperature industrial processes, electricity now can, there is an electric solution to it. And moreover, it can deliver that heat or that process at a lower cost than fossil fuels. Heat pumps are much more efficient than boilers. Motors are much more efficient than engines. I've sort of mentioned that, the importance of being able to use electricity flexibly for industry to minimize its costs. And industrial processes can be electrified, but innovation is still going to be needed and is still really important to deliver high temperature heat in particular, where we've still got a lot of challenges there, to continue to drive up in efficiency, drive down costs, and to deliver control and flexibility. You'll note I said very little about climate change or the costs of carbon. The reality is an awful lot of this is going to happen whether or not we're worried about climate change. well, clearly, I would argue that we need to worry about that. But the reality is that economics are driving most of this change, and it's the way the world is moving. So I would say that the electrification is the end goal for most industrial processes. The uncertainty, really, particularly in sort of areas like the UK, where the cost of electricity is going to remain higher because we have we're at higher latitudes, is there's going to be considerable uncertainty about whether there will be an interim sort of stage bringing in sort of hydrogen, carbon capture and storage or bioenergy solutions, or whether we're likely to move directly to industrial electrification. So that hopefully is a quick sort of summary scene setter, and I will hand over, or am I handing back to Sarah? I'm not sure.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks, John. So there's a couple of questions and a comment in the chat for you to take a look at, but we'll come back to those questions at the end as well. So we'll move straight on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Peace Adesina. Peace is a research fellow at the University of Leeds, and she's going to talk about the link between infrastructure deployment and opportunities for industrial decarbonisation.
Peace, you're muted.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Peace Adesina. I'm a research fellow in industrial decarbonization at the University of Leeds, working with Professor Peter Taylor. And today I'll be talking about the delivery of the challenges of low carbon infrastructure delivery to meet changing industrial energy demand. So we all know that industry plays a huge role in the UK economy in terms of like the economic value. As of 2024, it was given 231 billion pounds, in value, and that's 9% of the gross value added, and also, producing about 5 million jobs across the value chain. The emissions were about 12% of the UK total, and as of 2024, we had 46.5 million tons CO2, of which are industrial emissions. In 2025, the CCC, that's the Climate Change Committee, modeled the pathway to industrial decarbonization, and one of the things they mentioned was that electrification is going to be like the dominant source of emissions reduction. As you can see here, the green color is electrification, accounting for the largest share of cumulative abatement and expanding rapidly in the 2020s, as we have seen people are still changing their kits towards electric alternatives. CCS and hydrogen is still unsure within the UK setting, but we'll start seeing the impact around the early 2030s, particularly for industrial processes that are hard to electrify, as John was talking about. And the way to electrification is obviously we need network reinforcements, grid capacity, and many of these industries would largely fall into that area, as John said. But there's some, industries like cement that have also process emissions, which will need CCS. And so they would need, transport and a permanent geological storage site, and also proximity to that, to that area, to the store. Today, I'll be talking more about energy-intensive industries, EIIs, which are characterized by long capital investment cycles, with major production assets typically remaining in service for about 30 to 50 years, steel 40 to 60, cement about 25 to 40, and glass 12 to 20. And most of the core production facilities in foundation industries in the UK were originally established or significantly expanded during the post-war industrial period, which was in the 1950s to 1980s. And so what we can see now is that many of these assets are coming of age. Many sectors are entering a period of major reinvestments, requiring decisions on whether and how to replace existing capital equipment. Some businesses might, patch things up using maintenance, refurbishment, and maybe extend the life of their kits or their equipment. But at some point, they'll have to make this decision. And what we can see is that the investment decisions are increasingly being shaped by expectation of, future low carbon infrastructure availability, which they have three options, basically. One would be to either postpone decisions, which will cause carbon lock-in, higher transition cost, reduce competitiveness, or reinvest in conventional technologies, which will also be detriment to them because it will lead to technology lock-in, stranded assets, high transition cost, or they reduce or relocate production, which will lead to carbon leakage and deindustrialization or loss of jobs. So for steel, you can see that we are now entering the era where they have to change their kit. You can see that it's between 2000 and 2030 from the diagram here. And we can see the example of, Port Talbot, where they just recently changed their blast furnace, decommissioned it and started, the road to EAF, I think in 2024, and they're hopefully going to get that online 2027. And the same with cement. So the longer the asset cycle, the more it's really consequential, that they are able to get onto this low carbon infrastructure. If not, it's going to be a problem for them, for industries in essence, because they would either have this carbon lock-in or this technology lockout in essence, and missing this reinvestment windows can delay industrial decarbonization for decades and increase long-term transition costs. So I'll be talking about timelines within this slide. If a company were to apply for, let's say a steel company were to apply for, a low carbon infrastructure, let's say electricity, going through the EAF route, which is the electric arc furnace route, it would take about 3 to 5 years, looking at the timelines for Port Talbot. And it also depends on where you're located and also the electricity load which you need and the connection timelines and the build out of that. And for typical sites, it could take about 8 to 15 years. Currently, hydrogen and CCS is rolled out through the cluster. And so if you're maybe lucky, you are in a cluster, one of those priority clusters like, HyNet or the Humber cluster or the East Coast cluster together, it could be about 2 to 5 years. Because the operational date is about 2028 and large-scale integration will be into 2030. But if you're outside of those clusters, then it could take longer, 9 to 11 years, which most of these industries like the cement industry, the pig cluster, they're outside of these, clusters. And so we really need to pay attention to the delivery of, infrastructure for them so we don't lose this industrial base in the UK. So I'm going to give a quick case study of the Stanlow refinery. In 2021, the HyNet cluster was selected as one of the UK's first Track 1 cluster. By 2022, they bought a brand new, furnace that could run on both refinery fuel and also hydrogen. And they were hoping to be fueled, to start fueling it with hydrogen in mid-20s, about 2026. In 2025, they commissioned it. And it was a very huge investment of £45 million. But as at now, they're still waiting for hydrogen. And they've pushed the date further down to 2028, where they hope the Track 1 priority cluster would be operational. That's 2028. And in 2026, they're still, discussing FIDs, with deployment remaining dependent on, government support, CCS infrastructure, and also with the, recent uncertainty about UK CCS funding, it really places a lot of policy and financing risk to industrial decarbonization. So one of our recommendations, our tentative recommendations, in this area would be that the ongoing future and NESO planning functions adopt a whole systems approach, looking at not just, where the, not just industry, but where they are really located and, the sites and their needs. And we know that we have the RESP now, which is the Regional Energy Spatial Planning. But as they are developed and refined, structured engagement with industry, NESO, government, regulators would reduce uncertainty and help to identify those time critical sites and improve alignment with industry demand. And also industry it would be good if industry can also, engage with the government to tell them about, when they need to change their kit so that, there is not, so we don't lose them in this transition in essence. Also, the next one will be about how, the timelines of the sequencing of hydrogen and CCS is still very unclear with the recent government. And so, there needs to be some support frameworks on, the realities of the timings and, pathways for inland and dispersed sites, like what's going to happen to them since they are far away from, the rollout of infrastructure using clusters. And if they are not able to get on those, the track 1 or track 2 clusters, then at least electrification should be prioritized for them. The last one will be about the commercial viability. So we all know that as John mentioned, everyone knows about the electricity price in the UK. Narrowing the UK-EU electricity price gap will also help to make a business case for, electrification, and also price predictability for hydrogen and CO2 transport. This should be complemented with risk sharing mechanisms that move beyond just project level revenue support into more balanced allocation of risk, because these are first of a kind projects. So in conclusion, I just want to say that the UK is at the critical juncture in determining the future of its industrial base, over the next decade, and decisions made over this coming decade will influence whether energy intensive industries modernize or remain competitive in a low carbon economy or face further decline. The successful delivery of low carbon infrastructure, whether it's electricity networks, hydrogen, CO2, will be a key determinant to that outcome. This will require coordinated action from, all stakeholders, whether it's government, industry, regulators, Ofgem, NESO, network operators, investors. A well-managed and coordinated transition for energy-intensive industries can help unlock investment, strengthen industrial competitiveness, and support a new era of low-carbon industrial growth in the UK. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take questions and, comments on our recommendations.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peace. There is a question for you in the chat so far, but we'll come back to questions at the end, and I'll move on to our next speaker now, which is Matthew Rhodes. So Matthew is Managing Director at Camerus Limited and Director and Acting CEO at BCIC West Midlands. Matthew specialises in industrial decarbonisation, microgeneration, low and zero carbon energy policy, energy efficiency and demand-side energy system management, and innovation in business models. Matthew, over to you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. It's the first time I've been called a specialist in anything, I think, but it was quite a long list, so I'm still comfortable. Good afternoon, everybody. As Sarah said, my name's Matthew Rhodes, and I lead Black Country Industrial Cluster West Midlands, which came into existence about 7 years ago. I haven't got any slides. I'm just going to talk because I was very sensitive to the fact that Peace and John were probably going to steal. If I had put some slides together, they would probably steal half my thunder. So what BCIC does is we represent 5,210 businesses across the West Midlands region that would all call themselves energy intense, and they would all call themselves fundamental to the manufacturing economy of the UK. They weren't really captured by Peace in her talk because she was talking about the really substantial heavy industry in those, I think, 4 or 5 categories you talked about, largely located on the coast at Stanlow, Port Talbot, and so on. And I'm talking about the traditional manufacturing sector of this region, and a lot of my members are relatively small, so hundreds of employees, not thousands of employees, down to tens of millions, not billions. But they nevertheless employ many thousand people, and they are the heart of the UK economy. And if you do all the things Peace does, talked about there, and save those big, heavy foundation industries on the coast, that's really important, but it won't go anywhere if we lose the rest of the economy, will it? So anyway, I'm going to talk about 4 points, just to try and cover briefly. One is the economics of this whole space, which was kind of flagged, I think, by John to start with, particularly from the perspective of manufacturing industry in the West Midlands. So what does that look like? My second point will be about, again, this was flagged slightly by John, but given those economics, why is there still any of these people, why are any of these companies still based in the UK, let alone the West Midlands? So we'll talk about that. Then how energy and decarbonisation and energy demand fit into that picture. And again, on John's last slide, that he talked about carbon being kind of not really the driver, absolutely aligned with that. So this energy and decarbonisation is really, really important here, and it does a lot of positive things actually for this group. But it's not kind of, well, the decarbonisation bit isn't why they get involved. The energy bit actually is. And finally, I'll conclude like everyone else with some thoughts on the way forward. So if I start with the economics, I thought actually it might be helpful just to give you a little pen portrait of some of the companies I'm talking about. The businesses, so I've already given you a broad idea. We're talking about half of those companies will be in the metals sector of some form. A lot of them are in the really energy intense or high temperature heat metals bit, which is casting of metal. So you have to melt it. And if it's steel, that's well over 1,000 degrees C. If it's aluminium or lighter metals, it's about 800 degrees C heat to melt the metal. Or forging, in which case you still heat it and then you bash it, or just building bits of kit with the bits of metal once you've done that. So that's about half of our kind of base. The plastics businesses next, and rubber. So a lot of those businesses actually that were originally in metals have diversified, and they do both now. They do plastic and metal. Chemicals businesses, there was a much bigger chemical sector actually in this region a few years ago, but there's still some chemicals business, and food as well, food processing, which I guess exists worldwide. And some of those businesses, so I was at an aluminium foundry the other day, they employ somewhere under 100 people, but they've been around since about 1972, I think, and they are melting aluminium, making it into components for cars, like McLaren cars and similar, but also for the construction sector. So they'll be working in 3 or 4 different sectors, all these businesses. A metal forge business making bits for the construction sector and the automotive sector. They employ about 300 people. They've also got factories in Europe. And a specialty chemicals business, that one of my favourites really, they operate in about a dozen different industrial sectors. They supply additives for Nike trainers. They supply the smell that goes into the gas so that you know when there's a gas leak for the whole UK. And they supply all the balloons in the world with special party balloon. It's got their components in. They're based in the Black Country. They are based there despite the wishes of the managing director to relocate to China, where it could make a lot more money, because the family say that they should stay in this region, which I'll come back to in a second. When we talk about energy intense, just again to give you a little bit of a feel for that, around 90% of the energy bill of these companies will be in the manufacturing. It will be used to make whatever they make, whether it's a food item or a bit of metal. Very small amount is actually heating the office buildings and so on. So the energy costs will be between 10 and 20% of their total cost. So it's quite a significant sum of money. It's usually the second or third highest cost after the steel or the aluminium or the raw materials. Then you've got labour, then you've got energy, and it clearly varies quite a lot given the way the market goes up and down, which is a bit of a challenge. Yeah, so and that compares, that 10 to 20% of their costs compares with probably well less than 1% for an office-based business, or even just around 1% for a assembly-only business, that if you just stick the bits together to make a car, for example. So that's the kind of pen portrait of some of these businesses. In terms of the West Midlands energy consumption, their gas is still the biggest source of fuel used at about 6 gigawatt hours per year, and electricity is about 5.5 gigawatt hours per year. You can't that easily switch an aluminium, a non-ferrous foundry, over to electricity, because with steel or iron, you can use an induction furnace because iron and steel are magnetic. So you can heat using the induction furnace, which is most of them have switched to electricity in those sectors. In the non-ferrous sectors, they still use gas to get the intensity of heat that they can get through there. And heat pumps, you know, a long way away from supporting that, as John mentioned. And these businesses support about 75,000 people at the moment. If I put that in financial terms, so I talk about the economics, the gas and the electricity will cost them about £2 billion a year altogether at the moment, those 5,000 businesses. And the labour will cost them about 2.6 billion, £3 billion a year. So that kind of gives you an order of magnitude. And I say that because I'd like to just point out that if you moved all of those businesses, all 5,000 of them, to continental Europe, then what would happen is your wage bill would go up by about 50%. Talking fairly broadly, I'm sure you could find places where it's slightly less, slightly more. But your energy bills would halve, your electricity bills would halve. So you'd probably have about £500 million a year of more money, or £100,000 per company to spend on an employee or investing in modernisation, etc. So it would be more attractive to move to Europe. If you move to the US, you'd have to pay about the same for the salaries of the staff, but your energy costs, your electricity costs, would be about a fifth, not 5% less, but a fifth, 20% of what they are here. So you'd have around £1.5 billion more to invest in your firms in modernisation, assets and jobs and so on. If you went to China, you'd get the same energy bills as US roughly, and you'd also be able to get about a third the salary cost. So you'd be £3 billion better off. So any sensible business wouldn't be here, as I said, indicated at the beginning. They would have moved offshore already. And in fact, most OEMs, so the headlines of this, businesses, Ford, Jaguar Land Rovers, etc., take the energy intense bit of their business and they've moved that offshore. So they're still here in name and in sales office and in design, but they don't do the difficult bits of the manufacturing here. Should be arguably the still bits, the important bits, the skill bits, the strategic bits. Okay, so why are they still here? Why are those 5,000 businesses still here? I think there are a number of reasons. One is they've always been here. And when I say always, I don't just mean since the Industrial Revolution. So the geography of this area, it's got natural resource, it had natural resource in terms of iron and coal that were exploited going back to the Romans. They used those in those days. There were 20,000 blacksmiths within a few kilometres of Dudley Castle in 1620, according to one source anyway. And they used coal for heating and making weapons and stuff in Roman times. So we've been doing this for a long time. These are family firms. There's a different dynamic. I think that's quite important when you're looking at the kind of businesses Peace was talking about a few minutes ago. You deal with them as a government in one way. If you want to deal with family firms, you have to think carefully, I think, about how you actually address them. It's a different dynamic altogether. And it's probably quite important not to lose that. They are committed to the place. They're committed to the people they employ. And I think that's something valuable we might build on. I think the third reason they stay here is because they're in specialist markets. They've been canny enough to get into the nuclear sector or the defence sector, bits of the construction sector, which are not price sensitive from an economic point of view. So when your energy costs go up, you just pass on that cost to the Defence Ministry of Defence, who pass it on happily to the taxpayer or the Treasury, and you've seen that in the news in the last few weeks. And that seems to me a little bit circular and not very sensible, but that's true of a lot of our members. They're fundamentally sticky and difficult to move businesses compared to a office-based business, which you can pick up and put in New York or Beijing or whatever very, very quickly. Of course, you just can fly the people out there. You don't have to move a whole foundry or a whole forge. And there's a local market as well. And that is often the motivation for a foreign, maybe a European investor to buy the business and then just run it gently into the ground over a decade or two while the equipment's being used up. They don't invest enough to keep these businesses going, and that's a bit sad. So you get into a bit of a downward cycle if we're not careful. So that's the background before we even get into decarbonisation and energy. How does that fit in? I think very briefly, I mean, we have found, slightly surprisingly, but this is true not just in our part of the world, but all over the UK and actually all over the world, this whole agenda brings people together because business people recognise that this is a bit of it's a very risky area. Governments are going to do unpredictable things, whether that's in the low carbon, how we fund this transition, or if it's in the, oh, we need more oil, who are we going to invade next sort of thing. That people are going to do difficult things, and if it's 10 to 20% of your cost base and it's the most variable bit of your cost base, you worry about that, and you will go somewhere where you think you might find other people who've got the same problem and they might be able to help you. I think that common interest is the second reason that people come together, particularly in something like the UK energy market, which is a really complex beast, and it's quite difficult to understand how it works. And you need people to interpret it for you, you need intermediaries. And these kind of industrial cluster organisations partly act on that in that way, in a more credible way than anybody else. And it constantly frustrates me that you have to educate a lot of civil servants, for example, local government officers, about how manufacturing's actually made up, and that these companies are not like a house. And you can't just solve their heating problem and that will decarbonise them. It's really quite fundamental type issues out there. Nor is industry just Port Talbot Steelworks. It does consist of thousands of other businesses. And then, of course, you've got infrastructure requirements. So you can convert your aluminium foundry to hydrogen. So you use hydrogen gas instead of methane, but to burning methane to melt your aluminium. But if you can't get the hydrogen cheaply because you're not actually on a distribution pipeline, then you've got a problem, haven't you? So the infrastructure and the way the infrastructure is deployed is really important. And you can't, that's the collective thing. So you need to gang together and form a cluster of businesses to have a voice in those kind of conversations. So this decarbonisation is bringing people together.
Matthew, could we wrap up
yes,
here?
Yes,
Sorry,
final point. Yeah, so
over time.
It's kind of, is the hope for the future? Yes, I think there is a way forward. There's a really strong belief in this region that nuclear power is the answer, which is kind of helpful in that it's very simple and straightforward, and it's kind of not helpful in that it's not going to happen tomorrow. But there's a great deal of demand to have micronuclear. So I think there are steps towards that, though, and we have to work our way down this progressively, and we shouldn't. And I get frustrated with politicians telling me that, you know, a subsidy for solar power is transformational because it doesn't really move the dial. It's helpful. I don't totally agree with John on this one, because the difference between having a couple of megawatts of solar on your roof, which is you've spent the money, you're now getting very low cost on-site power from a renewable source, and you're not subject to global fluctuations in energy prices, and having to buy that power from the grid with the fluctuation and the link to the gas price, there's a massive difference. So it's almost a no-brainer to invest in solar already, I would say, in the UK for a lot of these sites. Smart controls, smart energy, flexibility, participating in that, yes, absolutely. Energy efficiency, absolutely. So we're doing all that already, and any sensible business should be doing it already. So absolutely. The second step, my reference to Andy Burnham, I think a publicly owned industrial energy company for each region of the UK would be a very sensible idea. This actually comes from, I had dinner a couple of weeks ago with an Indian gentleman from a very large Indian company, and I said, how is energy organised in India? He said, it's all like yours in the domestic sector, and we have, you know, private companies and they compete, but in the industrial sector, it's publicly owned as a utility for our members, and I think that's a really good idea. I think we should split electricity from gas. And we should have dedicated power plants. Actually, an industrial power pool would be a very good idea at a low cost, which is totally feasible.
Can we draw it to a close there, Matthew, and then maybe any other points could come through in the discussion afterwards?
Sure, Sarah.
Sorry to cut you off there, but
no,
I need
you
to
just
make
missed
sure
my
that
climax. That was all. That's all right, that's fine.
there's enough time for Imogen as well. So we'll move on to our final speaker to introduce Dr. Imogen Rattle. So Imogen's a research fellow in local low carbon industrial strategy. She's an energy social scientist working at the Sustainability Research Institute at the University of Leeds. Imogen.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And thanks, Matthew. I always like to hear you out. It's kind of one of my highlights. Okay, so I'm going to try to bring this all together quite fast, which is obviously quite a technical thing to do as there's a lot going on here. But my name's Imogen Rattle. I work on industrial decarbonisation place theme at BDRC. I'm actually based in Birmingham, and that picture at the front here is down the bottom of my road, and that's what many of the industrial estates around Birmingham look like, tucked between the train lines and canals, and I'll be coming back to those later. But before I do, I just want to point out the fact, to give some context, that energy in the UK is about 15% of final energy demand, but globally it is about 40% of final energy demand. It is the largest single sector in terms of demand, but it is relatively well known, and manufacturing industry, as I think Matthew's touched upon already, is not well understood. And this is particularly important now because Andy Burnham was yesterday confirmed as the next Labour leader, and his current watchwords are devolution, reindustrialisation and place. Now, I'm not a devolution expert, although my friends, I suspect in the next 3 years we are all going to become devolution experts, but I have been thinking about place and what that means for industrial energy demand for some time. So, hoping she goes on to the next slide. Right. So as we have, our presenters have touched on nicely, actually, you can approach industrial decarbonisation in one of three ways. You can think about intervention, which as John talked about in terms of electrification. You think about sectors, as Peace has talked about, in terms of the interventions in different sectors and their different timelines for investment. And you can think about place, as Matthew has. When you put those all together, you end up with three main policy interventions you need to think about: industrial strategy, what places and what sectors you're going to invest in; market creation, how you're going to pay for this; and infrastructure planning and deployment, how you're going to actually get your infrastructure in there. I'm going to touch on industrial strategy now because this is becoming very prominent. Modern industrial strategy has 8 sectors which it identifies as key for the country, 3 of which are not manufacturing industry at all. They're things like creative industry, 4 which are industry, which are things like advanced sciences, life sciences, advanced manufacturing, defence and clean British energy, and 1 which is a bit peripheral, which is digital. These, in essence, though, apparently all rely on the foundational industries, but I am not sure within government whether any work has actually been done, I hope there has, on how and what read through there is, and whether or not we've thought about the fact that actually this aluminium smelting place in the West Midlands is providing key pieces of kit for life sciences, let's say in defence, and it's about to move to China. So we need to think more deeply about our industrial strategy and how that links through to our foundational industries. And Andy Burnham, and I've read his book briefly this morning, Alice Garvey recommended it to me, so thank you, Alice. It's called Head North. When he talks about reindustrialisation, which he does a fair amount, is talking, I think, about things like infrastructure projects. He's talking about construction of energy supply. And these are definitely needed, but infrastructure projects and construction are not in themselves foundational industries. So I think we have a gap there between how we actually read through between our strategies and our actual foundational industries and what the links are, and we need to address this. Moving on then, and quickly segueing into my other research. For the last 5 years, I've been looking at different forms of industrial decarbonisation at different scales, starting off with clusters for IDRIC, moving on to local industrial clusters, which I know a couple of representatives are here, so nice to see you, and then moving more swiftly onto dispersed sites and how we decarbonise those. And those kinds of dispersed sites are very much the SMEs which Matthew has been talking about, so I don't need to explain them to you. Essentially, 84% of emissions are in 14% of SMEs. Mostly these are industrial SMEs, and we know that their energy use is not in their building construction, it is in their processes, and that processes are complex and often bespoke and difficult to decarbonise. We also know that only 1% of industrial SMEs, or sorry, all SMEs actually engage with energy efficiency advice, so we need better routes to decarbonisation. Catherine Sugar and I, Catherine's at Manchester University, have been looking at better routes to engage industrial SMEs, thinking about things like audits, thinking about supply chains and the like. We know that awareness is an issue, but it's not really about awareness, it's about implementation barriers and it's about fear of production disruption, which we really need to engage with. We also think, building on Matthew's point, that not many people really know about manufacturing industry, what it does in the UK, and therefore it is very difficult for us to find the skilled people to actually talk to industrial SMEs, and that's a skills gap we need to address. So we're kind of building on what we think, and we're working with a animation to kind of get this in a non-AI generated format. But the important things, I think, are firstly to speak the right language of industrial SMEs and to understand their particular operational requirements. At present, many of us do not speak industry's language. Many of us do not even understand industry. And we also need to think about this coordination piece. Place is important. People do have a regional identity. Industry is stickiness. But I have some slight industry is sticky, sorry, but I have some slight reservations in that one person's devolution gender is another person's postcode lottery, and we have to be careful that these kind of place-based approaches don't further inequality. Finally, then, as I say, it was a very quick romp. If we think about these three approaches to industrial decarbonisation, at the intersections, we also have key elements about justice. So the just transition is about the places and the sectors we invest in and the places that don't. Cost allocation is about who pays for things like electrification, and Energy UK and the CBI were in the news again today calling on Andy Burnham to address how renewable energy costs are allocated. And then we also need to think about social licence to operate and where infrastructure is built and who has to deal with that. And so all of these are highly political contentious, and all of them have potential to have impacts at the ballot box. So I guess my final thought to lead you with is that the changing shape of industrial energy demand is not just an obscure question that this select audience are interested in, but something with far greater political salience and something that we need a greater awareness of. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Imogen. So we've caught a bit of time up there to give us still some time for discussion. So that's very helpful. So I'll maybe just in terms of picking up on some of the things that have happened in the chat, maybe ask a bit about this cost issue, as a few people have mentioned it, but also there was a bit of a question around cost in the chat. But how might we address the issue of energy costs in a way that supports industrial decarbonisation? I'll maybe ask John to mention something on this first and then go to Matthew, but the question was aimed at John a bit at first, I think.
Yeah, I mean, nothing's easy in this area. There is an awful lot of wastage within the way that we price electricity at the moment and the way that we use electricity, and getting rid of some of that waste is a good starting point. I think the market arrangements that we've got were great in the 2010s when they were designed. I think everyone would agree they're not fit for purpose now. In fact, there was a consultation on reform of electricity markets that came out that broadly said the status quo was not an option. And 5 years later, we still got the status quo. So there is a huge amount we could do to change pricing and the way that works. I also think that there is a big question around whether some of our policy costs should be put onto energy bills or whether they should actually be dealt with as general taxation. But at the end of the day, there is not enough money to go round. And if you're reducing energy bills, what are you going to effectively, if you're reducing energy bills by putting additional government spending else into the things, what are you going to cut instead? So it's easy to say shift policy costs into government. It's much more difficult to make that happen in practice.
Okay. Matthew, did you want to come in here? Because you'd suggested a kind of setting up of a more public ownership of.
Yeah, well, very quickly. I mean, I've got a chart in front of me. If we took 100% of the policy costs off UK electricity prices, they would still be more expensive than all other European electricity costs, including their policy costs, we would still not be competitive. So that's a small step that we could take. So the 2 points: REMA, the Reform of Electricity Market that John referred to. There was a proposal put forward in that to split electricity from gas prices, and the current government's actually said they want to do something along those lines. So Ed Miliband said it earlier this year, and that would be a really helpful thing to do to allow electricity prices to be much lower. I like the proposal put forward by Professor Michael Grubb from UCL 3 or 4 years ago, which was basically for an industrial pool, purely for industry, where electricity is put into the pool from very low cost generators, wind farms and nuclear and so on, and then you supply your industry from that. And that's what the Indians do and other countries do, and I don't see why we can't do that. I thought it would add on to consumer bills, so I asked him and he said, oh, we've done the modelling and it's a negligible amount. So I don't know why we didn't do that. I think why, no, I do know actually, they said that there would be gaming of the system and people would pretend to be industry in order to get the cheap electricity, then they would sell it to others. Well, I think we could handle that. My other point would be regional solutions. You'd have less opportunity for gaming because you'd know everybody within the region. And I'm talking about 5,000 people, businesses. You would be able to kind of get your head around those. That would be much easier to monitor. I think we should have, the one point I didn't say in my talk was zero carbon hubs. So you actually provide little zones where you provide very cheap energy because you build a local power plant, or you supply it from, you sleeve it through from a hydro plant or wind farms and so on. You can do imaginative things here if you're prepared to accept that regions will be different. And I heard what you said about postcode lottery, Imogen, but we could do that as part of our industrial policy, couldn't we? And that would make bits of the country really attractive to locate your energy intense business, like East Anglia, which is near the sea and has got a lot of space. I'm sure you want to farm there as well, but that's what politics is about for me. We need to make tough decisions like that, and then we can do it. One size fits all market for the country is not a very sensible way to approach this problem.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. I'll maybe ask a question of Peace next. So there was a comment in the chat about the Stanlow plant and the way in which its transition had been supported, and that some of that support mechanism is now no longer available. And I wonder what you thought about the way in which some of the asset timelines that you spoke about, how that asset transition might or might not need financial support. How might that work?
Okay, so I think with the EIIs, they actually need a lot of support from the government because these are really heavy industries, and there's a lot of the investment is quite expensive. Like for the Stanlow one, it was about £45 million investment in just the furnace, and I mean, there are many other assets within the refinery. And so, yeah, it's just about, I think, more clarity to what is going on with hydrogen and CCS and where the government is going with it. Would we really help, energy intensive industries to know the way forward, and whether, yeah, I don't want to say anything too negative, but but that's where I stand.
Okay, thank you. Imogen, did you want to come in here?
Yeah, I'll just comment briefly on that. I think the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund was ended and we haven't got a replacement. We wait with bated breath for the revised industrial decarbonisation strategy, which was meant to come out earlier this year, but hasn't. And I think, it's obviously been quite a tumultuous time in politics, but when is it not? But I would hope that with Burnham we will get a bit more policy clarity. And if he's serious about reindustrialisation, he needs to be serious about actually funding reindustrialisation, because it's not going to happen by itself. So I'm hoping that we will see some clarity. We know that the new defence spending announcements mean that DESNZ is going to have to find about £2 billion over the next couple of years. So I don't know where that's going to come from. We are in a time of change, but when are we not? But yes, I think the first thing that industry always talks about is energy prices. The second thing they talk about is connection queues. And the third thing they talk about is policy clarity. And that is what I'm hoping we will have shortly.
Lovely. Those are very interesting points there. We're out of time for the questions, so apologies, colleagues, who I think some questions were actually answered in the chat, and there was also a bit of a discussion on cybersecurity, which was very interesting as well. I want to just highlight to you that slides will be shared, and this recording will go on the YouTube channel for EDRC, but can also be shared via other channels. So if you would like to get in touch and ask how you could share the content on our behalf, then please let us know. We're quite happy to have other people promote for us. And thank you very much to our speakers today. It's been really, really helpful. Thank you to attendees, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Energy Demand Research Centre event. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.